Welcome back, everyone, to the Vikingology podcast.
Yes, welcome back. It's been a while.
No, the art and science of the Viking Age.
Oh, the art and science of the Viking Age. See, this is it. It's been a while. The last person we talked to was Ben Rathfield, and that was like the 1st of September. But there's an important reason why we had a little pause, and that is because you and your lovely wife were incubating a new little Viking.
And he is sleeping right here. and so if he wakes up, if you hear a baby crying today, that's why. It's not a sound effect, it's a real baby. Yeah, so he's sleeping soundly.
It's not a commentary on how good or bad the podcast is. Today's his 2 weeks birthday, so congratulations to you and your family.
Correct. Yeah, 2 weeks. It's been 2 weeks. Can you see it on my face?
No, you look good. But we actually had to reschedule this podcast with our guest, Dr. Tom Horn. So we thank you for your patience and your flexibility. And we were trying to work out schedules, but we're finally here. So let's see. So I'm going to let everybody know who you are, but then we'll start with a little bit of a quiz, right? CJ, you know where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so Dr. Tom Horn is an archaeologist and historian. Yay, got the historian part in there. Specializing in the Viking Age and Viking trade networks. And so what I really like is you've got like this multifaceted thing going on. So you're not just kind of an academic, but you've got like a real sort of public face to what you do, which we love around here at Vikingology, because that's what we're all about too, is making sure that the public knows about this interesting history. But so public history, archaeology, all that mixed together in working in things like, or at places like the BBC as a historical researcher, and also now the company Red River Archaeology. And you're still working there, correct?
Yeah.
Yep. And then you volunteer at a museum. So that's even also great for public outreach. So the Govan Stones Museum in Glasgow, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And also you have a podcast as well, and we will make sure that our audience knows about all of these things so they can check you out in all of these various places. But so your podcast is called The Shindig, which is really cool. I don't know whoever came up with that name. That was brilliant.
It wasn't me. It would have been Tanai and Johnsky in season 1. I heard there was a lot of work going into that to get it to work, and there's a play on words in it. It's fun. It's got that Celtic element because we're a sort of British and Irish company. So yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah. So if you get the word dig in there with archaeology, I guess you've succeeded, right?
Stop there. That's fine. If you got fun with digging it, you're good.
So you also, you published, quite a bit, articles, but also a book in 2021, which we will also link up, which is really interesting. A Viking market kingdom in Ireland and Britain, semicolon, trade networks in the importation of a Southern Scandinavian silver bullion economy. And also,
Snappy, I know.
Was that
a really catchy title?
Was that really an editor, or it just rolls off the tongue?
Yeah, I tend to call it the post-colonic for good reason. So.
But you've also co-edited another book about the Viking Age in Scotland, so that's cool, and we can talk about that a bit as well. But and you've done archaeological fieldwork, so dude, you do everything, man. This is awesome. Welcome.
I try. Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you guys for having me on. And yes, we were trying to arrange this for a while, and obviously you had lovely life events going on, and I was away digging early medieval archaeology as well. So it all turned out for the best.
Yeah, I saw some of those amazing pictures that you were posting on your social media, like on Twitter and Instagram, and that looked like you were having a heck of a good time.
Yeah, I mean, what I do with public outreach as well, it helps, as you guys will know, that archaeology is just so photogenic. It just you just sort of point a camera at something or film it, and it's going to look good. It appeals to people. So although the caveat for that is on an early medieval site, people were talking about, it's 50 shades of brown. So there's just slightly different changes.
Archaeology porn.
It's kind of that, if you know sort of thing, but often you spend half your time with the sort of filters on your photographs trying to get it so you can actually see that thing that you could see on the day. But the photograph is just this sort of slightly brown, sort of beige sort of puddle in the middle. So yeah.
Well, so before we get started, we sometimes like to have a little fun figuring out what kind of Viking our guests are. And so I have a little quiz for you. And so it's going to be some things, you know, and I don't know if you looked at any of our other podcasts, but we've done it with a few people. But anyway, so I have a few things that I'll ask you, like, so give you a choice of two things, and then you choose which one appeals to you the most. All right.
Cool.
Right, here we go. All right. Ale or mead?
Ale.
Okay. Silk or wool?
Long distance trade networks has got to be silk.
This is for you, no? Okay. Beef or skyr?
Oh, skyr.
Ooh. Now, I probably know how you're going to answer this one. Iron or silver?
No, well, yes. Well, I think silver is kind of at the root of everything ever. So I'll go silver.
Oh, wow. Okay. A canoe or a long ship?
Long ship.
Thor or Jesus?
Can I not be a Viking and at some stage choose both? Not have one of those Thor's hammers that's got a bit of a cross element
on the other side. You're the syncretic Viking.
Yeah. I'll do that. Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, like split the middle there. Okay. Lindisfarne or Constantinople?
Constantinople, definitely.
All right. And lastly, a sword or a rock?
Depends if there's any silver in the rock. But is it an ore? I don't know. I'll go a sword. As soon as you said that, I think if anyone's ever been to the National Museum of Scotland, there's the sword hilt from Eigg, the Isle of Eigg, EIGG, and it's one of the most beautiful pieces of art that you can see. It's so I'd go for a very, very nicely decorated sword.
All right. Well, I think you are falling in the category of being a fancy later period urban Viking.
Sounds about right.
The only thing you did, I mean, so you would be one of those like vegetarian Vikings because you didn't choose beef.
I think it's just reflecting being a middle-aged man and the red meat I've got to cut back on. So yeah, I think that it's all fitting.
Oh, but you still had the ale there in you, so it brought you back down to earth a little bit. You didn't go for the highfalutin mead stuff, right?
It just really evolved.
Yeah, I know.
Like when she asked me, it was just, you know, you're either a high class or a low class Viking. And now we're going to like late Viking age urban contemporary Viking with makeup. You know, like what? I'm really specific now, Terry.
I'm not in beer I'm in Sigtuna now. I'm in that later. It's kind of that niche. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Metro Viking.
You're a metrosexual Viking, right? Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, okay. So, I mean, I don't even know where to start with this. I have so many questions for you. And I know, we were emailing and I had shared with you that little piece that I wrote because I think the economic piece of it is so interesting. And so we'll link this up, whatever, but the ideas of this older economist in the United States from literally like 100 years ago. And if you're American and you have any sort of interest in economics or academia, you probably have heard at least the name Thorstein Veblen. But this guy who was like writing about this stuff like 100 years ago, and then I'm reading your book and it was just like, this is like what he's talking about, how so these Viking trade networks that, a lot of this stuff was probably not just these one-off little whatevers that sometimes we've been, and I don't want to say led to believe, but, just sort of the rando quality of like, a couple guys getting into a boat and going off and sacking a monastery or something. But that it was much more, and especially over time, much more highly sort of coordinated and structured than that. And it really is kind of like creating an enterprise that sort of goes international. And so I'm kind of want to ask you your thoughts about that, because you're talking about trade networks that are Britain and Ireland, but of course it originates or it extends from other places in the Viking world. So, maybe what about that interested you? And then, what do you think about, that kind of hypothesis?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're talking about where it starts, and this seems to start, Sweden, central Sweden, Gotland, in terms of what I'm looking at, sort of trade networks and these sort of movements. And of course, they seem to be going east at that time into the sort of Russian-Ukrainian river systems, linking up with the sort of caliphates world and the various emirates that are around that as well. But I find it's difficult with the pioneers, because by necessity, it's usually got small numbers and it's early. So it's kind of difficult to find out. But so what I kind of am interested in is how, and I think what you're interested in as well, Terry, is how these things become kind of, solidified, how they kind of get structured, and then how people get interested in seeing that there's a structure that works. And I think what's happening in the Viking Age in terms of trading and running slave networks, which I think is kind of behind most things, is that you've got the pioneers that go out, and maybe they're from Gotland, maybe from the area around where Birka is to the west of modern Stockholm. So they're off, and these are small groups. These are the small groups you're thinking. It's a village. It's a group of cousins that are going out to do that. But I'm interested in the people who observe those patterns and see what is successful and what works. So I'm kind of interested in, say, the people in southern Scandinavia. And when I say southern Scandinavia, that's also Skåne, Scania, that southern part of Sweden. It's the Oslo Fjord, part of southern Norway, and what we consider Denmark and probably northern Germany and into Friesland, sort of Frisia at the moment. It's those people that are sort of looking at what's happening in the East and the Baltic and saying, okay, they're stripping out kind of what works. They're looking at saying, you can't control trade networks at that time, but you can make your trading site attractive to people, and then you can bring all this money, all these slaves, all these raw materials, all the silver that's associated with it in terms of a means of payment, cash money, and you can funnel that in. And I think that's what the Southern Scandinavians are doing. And then from my book, what I'm sort of saying is what they are doing, particularly in the Low Countries, Northern France, what they're doing in Ireland in the sort of 840s, 850s, and then what they're doing with the Great Army in England and in southern Scotland and Wales, is they are sort of taking the lessons that have been learned in the sort of 8th century and maybe earlier in the Baltic and the East, and that's been taken by these southern Scandinavians, and they made it into something that you can sort of replicate. The sort of jobs, when I start a job, I say, I'm kind of not interested in doing one-off things. I'm trying to make structures and make things that are replicable. So I've always say, if I get hit by a bus, there's some legacy there. There's structures in place, because anyone can have not anyone can have a one-hit wonder. It's very difficult to have a one-hit wonder, but you know what I mean. There's a chance to do that, but it's that repeated success. It's these sports teams that say it's not winning it the first time, it's winning it again and again and again. I think if what the people are doing in Southern Scandinavia and then are bringing it to the sort of Britain and Ireland, I think they're seeing the things that can be replicated, and they're going to Britain and Ireland with a sort of idea that they want to create. They want to bring these trade networks that are linking them to the Baltic and the Middle East. And they also then want to say, okay, we need particular types of sites, because that's where we can replicate, that's where we can have secure trade and do things in a long term. And hence why you'd be interested in setting up something like Dublin, and why you'd be interested in sort of revivifying somewhere like Jorvik, as they would have known it.
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, that was my contention too, as far as, again, so my students, and CJ and I have talked about this too. I mean, they read James Barrett's article, about what caused the Viking Age, and he's focusing on the West. And it's sort of like, okay, why is the West different than what was going on in the East? And it's like, oh, maybe these kind of smaller scale raids and, more rural than urban phenomenon and all of that. But it's kind of like, yeah, but it's not like it's this whole sort of different thing, full stop. It's just that, when you're kind of getting going, you start small and you start local, right? And then, but what you're doing is like what you're saying, at least in my mind too, is that somehow through contact, you've sort of sussed out what's going on, right? And and you just sort of want to get in on the action. And it's the beginnings of that. It's the beginnings of the spreading of this trade even farther.
Yeah, it was Blogfist in Søren Sindbag. There's so many. One reason just to get my book first plug, is that you can actually see all the people that I've read that have had the really good ideas that I've kind of based everything on. And Blogfist talking about network kingdoms is one of those moments when you're suddenly like, everything started to make sense. It's one of those you read. It was a chapter in a book, and suddenly it's network kingdoms, and he's talking about you're sort of controlling, again, not controlling the actual routeways, but you're trying to encourage them to bend them towards an area that you can control. And that was the sort of the game changer for me, that there was maybe this sort of playbook that had been developed in the Baltic that was then kind of transposed into sort of Ireland first, and then Britain. That's why I call it, and my title is Ireland and Britain, because I think they're doing it in Ireland first. I think there's a big contention for what's happening in Dublin. There's basically, long story short, is there's possibly Norwegians or Northern Scandinavians that are the first ones that are settling in Dublin, but something big happens around about 850, and there seems to be a change in management. And I think what's happening then, it's these Southern Scandinavians. You can't really call them Danes because whatever, but they're from Southern Norway. They're from Denmark, wherever. They've probably been in the Low Countries in Francia. Some of them will have been born there, sort of thing. So they're this different sort of group. And I think what happens in the 850s is this is when they've identified, okay, Dublin is a good place if you're wanting to set up a slave trading exercise, because you've got the warring Irish kingdoms and the overkings, so that's producing lots of captives, lots of potential slaves. And I think that these Southern Scandinavians say, okay, we'll have some of that. And then that's they take over your new management in Dublin. And why do you take over somewhere? Because they're doing something right already. And what are they doing? They're bringing these ideas that they've seen working in the Southern Baltic and the Central Baltic, and they're bringing them to Ireland. And then what I think is then happening in the 860s with the Great Army is elements of these guys that are being in Dublin, the Low Countries, and the Baltic. They're then saying, okay, what can we do that's similar in this very rich, centralized, the heptarchy, whatever. But there's all these sort of really sort of robust kingdoms that have got minting. They've got money. They're organized. That's why the Normans come in, is because you've got this amazing kingdom that's there that's very, very organized. So they recognize that, but then they recognize they've got somewhere like a York, or they try their best to keep London, but it's just too close to Wessex really to do that. So Jorvik is the place that they can say, okay, this is Dublin Mark II. This is our sort of British and Irish Mark II of, and then that's why I think for the rest of the first Viking Age, they're always trying to keep Dublin and York together, because that's the key. You want to have these major trading centers, and then from that you can link in, you can sell slaves through the Mediterranean, or you can trade across the North Sea into the Baltic and get some of that silver, the dirhams that which I talk about a lot.
So I think plug number 2 for your book. So the other part of the book title is a Viking market kingdom, right? And so then that's clearly, I mean, it's a special kind of little beast, right? Because it's not like a territorial kingdom like we usually think of, right? It's these markets that in their sort of individual little cells all together create a kingdom. It's the network, right?
And that's it. I mean, what you want to do with empires, obviously empires are not a good thing, but the people who set them up, what they want to do is, I think it is, without sounding neoclassical, whatever, it's at least cost path. You're trying to set up the British. I also go back to the British Empire as like a terrible thing, but what it tries to do, and whenever it gets into trouble, whenever it goes inland, as you'll have seen with the 13 colonies, all the friction is starting when the colonists want to move inland, but the British are like, no, that's expensive. You have to fight the Native Americans. You have to fight the French. There's Spanish there. We just want all the sort of nice mercantile ports, and we can take the money and we can exploit the slaves and the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and everything goes wrong in the 1760s because everyone's trying to expand and make it a territorial sort of empire, and the British kind of inherently understand that that's really not going to work. And then with the British Empire, again, when it expands post the American Revolution, I also have a sideline in the American Revolution, by the way, you might tell. they have informal empires in southern and Central America, but it's just like Buenos Aires, that they'll control all the credit, for example, and that's kind of what they want to do. They don't want to expand inland. And where it all starts to go wrong and you get the worst excesses of empire is when they start to, the race for Africa, for example, when they're trying to do it beyond the ports, or what's now Mumbai, for example. That's when things go wrong, because again, then you're having to control millions of people at times who very much don't want you to be there. You don't want to be there, because you just set this out as a way to get, in this mercantilist world, to get money and trade and bring that back in through largely sort of London, essentially, and control the money. So empires tend to go wrong when you've got all this territory control. What you want to do, certainly for certain types of empire, is control the money, control the credit, and control the trading sites.
So maximum outputs, least amount of inputs is possible, right? Yeah, I mean,
people are kind of, we're all inherent. Lazy is the wrong word. I think lazy is the wrong, completely wrong word. But if you can get the same result for much less effort, 99% of people, 99% of the time will do that, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think that brings up a good point too, with the Vikings staying in coastal areas, not trying to make mainland invasions. And you mentioned in the 850s, there's a changing of the guard in Ireland. Now, my understanding is that the Irish had two words to describe different types of Vikings. It's unclear who's who and what's what, but we think we know. And there's the Dubgal, which would be supposedly the Danes, the dark Northerners, and then the Fingal, the light Northerners, the Norwegians. I think that's what I've read. But there's also some contention there as to how exactly these terms were used. But in 847, very pivotal year, I'm actually writing a book that is in that year right now about an invasion of the Brittany region of France, La Bretagne, right after they declared independence from the Carolingian Empire. Then Vikings arrived and started a mainland invasion and won 3 successive battles against the king of Brittany, Nominoe. And the writing was on the wall. It looked like it was over. At the same time, in Ireland, the Vikings lost 3 consecutive battles against the Irish and were effectively expelled from Ireland. And that's when you see the force in Brittany actually collapse and withdraw. Right. So it's the idea there is that there was a supply line that was allowing them, so basically that network. And once that network was interrupted, they had to leave because there's no way they could support themselves. But I think, so 847, what I see is, to your point, is there's a lot of trial and error happening with the Vikings, where they did try mainland invasions and it was expensive and it was costly, and it was costly in terms of lives, not just finances. And then the supply lines to keep those things active were too unstable to really support it. And then if you fast forward later in that region, where they do make inroads in the early 10th century, where they actually occupy most of Brittany, and then there's I always call it a reconquista just because of El Cid, but there's this guy Alain Barbe-Torte. He reconquered Brittany on behalf of the Bretons, and then when they took Nantes, it was a derelict city. Like the Vikings have made no effort to turn it into a flourishing trade port like they had York. And I think to that point is the amount of effort. And I know you said we don't want to use the word lazy, but it almost seems lazy, right? Where they went that far and they're like, all right, let's reorganize this economy and move all the wealth out and then move it back up through Ireland and all that. But then the actual effort to like make it a durable colony, right? They're just like, it's just not worth it, right? Because we're just going to get sucked into the Carolingians, the Bretons, whatnot. So that's an interesting point, because there's that mystery, right? Why was not left derelict? And then you just brought up a really interesting idea of, well, it's just because the economics of it, right? Like it just wouldn't have made economic sense to continue to push inward, right?
Yeah, and I think the Vikings are very much, I think, horses for courses. I think they presumably, if that had worked, I'm sure they would have treated it like a York. You've got if you've got Roman walls or whatever that you can piece together, if you've got rivers, if you've got sea access to it, it's going to tick certain boxes. But I mean, there's certain things as well. I think whenever you look back in this distant past, there'll be factors now that we just couldn't even conceive. They'll have that slightly different mental architecture, and they would have just known this doesn't feel right, or they, as you're alluding to earlier with the networks and the trade routes. At that time, the money's maybe going down to Al-Andalus, for example. They're trading there, so there's kind of no point dealing in Brittany, and Brittany is an area, as you say, with the Franks, or the Carolingians and the Bretons are both quite fierce. And it's similarly, they don't go inland, particularly as in Ireland. There are certain areas that they're quite fierce people that they think actually know. So I don't know about not too much in terms of its topography or whatever. There potentially just some vulnerability that they assessed there, or there as a transshipment point, it didn't make much sense. You weren't saving too much effort. You may as well just go straight to some of the big markets in Sevilla, whatever now as well. You may just go to the southern coast of Spain. So yeah, on that particular one, yeah, I just say, but in general, I usually think what's the horses for courses option, and they'll just go with what works at that time, and that can change over time.
So I want to actually kind of backtrack a little bit just for our audience and sort of establish like who we are talking about here, because I think, I mean, for a lot of people, probably, I mean, some of this stuff would be like, oh, well, that's interesting that they would actually be sort of that forward thinking about it, or that strategic about it, or that sort of coordinated, or whatever word you want to use, right? That, oh, these are like these knuckle dragger people that, beat each other up with swords that lived 1,200 years ago, and that they wouldn't have been sort of as sophisticated in the corporate sense like we have in modern companies, and especially in not only sort of starting these things, but expanding them. And so, like, who is it? Is it the Sea Kings? Is it, do we know people by name? Do we have any idea of like, who's the El Chapo of the Viking cartel, right? That's sort of helping to kind of orchestrate and keep this business going and expanding into these various areas. Do we know?
I think, we'll never quite know, but I think if you look at their prominence in the English and Irish sources, you've got, Olafur and Ivar being the main one, that has the dynasty that forms it. But I think, and again, this is idea whether you this idea of are they actual brothers? Are they blood brothers? Or are they just essentially sort of colleagues? But I think if you can understand Ivar, I think you can understand the kind of figure that we're talking about. We're talking about people you don't quite know where they're from. You think maybe from the way they operate that they're maybe more like Southern Scandinavians, that they're setting up and they're thinking of themselves in that urban world. So they're setting up and they're going to places like Dublin and York. That's where they're gravitating towards, which again would make you think it's possibly more likely that they're from the southern part of Scandinavia. With Olaf as well, and Ussel, they're various figures. But I think the repeating names of these figures, the fact that they're in Britain and Ireland and they're connected to this great army in the way that the great army seems to work, and it's again they seem to be setting up these essentially sort of mobile towns, and you get with the Longford essentially the equivalent of a winter camp in Ireland before you get the winter camps in England and probably even southern Scotland as well that we haven't found yet. I think these are the figures that we're talking about. With underneath them, I think structures, you get hints in the history as well. You probably get groupings of ships, whether they're from a particular region or they're just groups of people that have worked together in the past. And because I think you get in the histories, you'll get groups of ships that will just go off and they're all meant to be raiding the Seine, and some of them will just think, actually, no, and they go off to Brittany, but then they'll all join back again later. So I think these are kind of fairly contingent groups, but I think there's certain major figures that cause these groups to sort of coalesce for periods and for periods within a year. But I think, yeah, you're going to be talking about the Olafs and Ivars and how much of their story is legendary or not. But again, their names get mentioned in multiple sources, and it fits with my model of where you'd expect people to be involved. Probably originally in the Low Countries, Francia, then they're in Ireland, then they're in England and Scotland up until the late 70s, early 80s. So that's a kind of people that I think that you're dealing with. You will have major figures, but beneath that you'll have groups that will sort of coalesce and dissipate, and they'll come back together, and it'll just as and when suits. But there's that game theory of eventually you've got to get enough people together, enough groups, enough ships, enough groups of ships together to be effective. So there's a certain point where you can't go off and do your own thing too much. So you kind of need leaders, or you need strategists, again, for want of a better word, that look in terms of long term and who've had this experience in the parts of the world, the Baltic, the Russia and Ukraine, and are bringing that experience and the sort of goals over, what works and what might work in this particular area.
I mean, it's just so interesting to me, the intricacies of it, and just to think about, all right, like, who's the dude that's writing the check? It doesn't, and especially with the escalation in the 9th century, I mean, it is not cheap in resources, human, natural, or time to build these ships and get these groups of guys on the road, or on the sea road, as it were. And yet it happens. And then you think about like modern trucking companies. All right, who are the logistics guys who are doing all of the sort of scheduling of like, okay, this year you're going to go over here and do this? Or, I mean, is there that level of like sophistication going on? And then also thinking about the Viking Age and just the nature of communication networks and how slow or fast communication may travel. I mean, like, how do you manage to do all this? It's just astounding to me.
And I think that's it. I think, we'll talk about, communities today at the sea that's been passed down from generation to generation. And, people, you'll all have known people that have been at sea a lot, and they can kind of smell when a storm's coming as well. And nowadays, thankfully, they've got the weather forecast too, but they'll just know from particular swell, and they'll pass that on to their son or daughter, and then they'll pass it on. And then there's just this, within groups, people within particular villages, within locales, people just kind of know how the river acts at a certain time of year, or when the wind shifts direction, they're like, it may be fine to go out to sea, but as soon as you get past the end of that point, it's going to be bad. And then you get into the whole world of these amazing place names that you've got. I know in Brittany as well, you've got the Scandinavian place names, and through sort of Cornwall and Wales. And the best one I like in terms of, again, how this is being passed down is Cape Wrath in the northwest coast of mainland Scotland, which basically means turn left at Albuquerque. So it's Cape Turning Point. And so you've got this idea that they're kind of they're speaking to each other through these topographical points in the landscape, and that's getting passed down. That must be getting passed down through people that are moving a lot, and people that are moving a lot are probably fairly wealthy. They're probably fairly connected. So again, it's just going to be these same relatively small numbers of people that kind of have all the information, and they spread that through their family, and that's a form of wealth as well. This knowledge that you can spread of where to go, which rapids. We've got the Byzantine emperors that are using Scandinavian names for particular rapids through Ukraine and Russia, because that's where they're getting the names for. The rushing one, the silent one, the noisy one in terms of rapids. And so I think what the Scandinavians trade in is this knowledge of river routes and sea routes, as much as they are trading in slaves and silks and whatever else that they're trading at that time. But I think the knowledge economy is a huge one in the Viking Age.
I think that's interesting, because we always sort of, at least in modern West, or maybe even the modern world, we sort of think of ourselves as living in like the information age. But like, in a certain sense, all of human history is an information age, right? I mean, that's how people are having to survive, is by the passing of that knowledge.
Yeah, and I mean, I read a few years ago that they say intelligence now is not necessarily knowing things, it's knowing how to find that information. So you don't necessarily have to retain much in your head. Again, let's go back to this, we're kind of least cost path as beings, particularly much. But that is certainly not true for parents, grandparents' generation. That's learning by rote. And people now say, well, it's a bad thing. But, when you don't have an access to a computer at home, or you couldn't even afford books, you had to know that times table in your head. Right. And I think that's very much a way that our grandparents' generation before would understand the Viking world probably intuitively better than we do, because what you have in your head, what you can talk to your family about, that's your knowledge base, that's your internet. And I think that's how valuable it would be, because if you've got someone that knows how to get successfully to Dublin, that's worth a huge amount of money, because that means that then everyone in your village or everyone in your sub-kingdom can get there reliably, and that's kind of priceless.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to sink my teeth into something that you mentioned, which is this idea that there's small populations. I think in the modern lens, we think of the Vikings in terms of how they were painted in the 19th century, which is these hordes of heathens who descended upon Christendom and ravaged the people, et cetera, et cetera. But we're really talking about a very small group of people. But I think it'd be worth discussing, like, how small of a group are we talking? Because Scandinavia at the time, the population was low. You compare it to, say, France or England and whatnot. I mean, it is a small place. And then they start expanding all over the world, so they're spreading themselves even thinner. So I think it's worth exploring, like, just how small were these groups, and then how big of an impact, basically, like, you know, how big of an impact were these tiny little groups having in proportion or comparatively to other groups at the time, right? So the Viking shows up. How big of an impact is this tiny little group of Vikings having compared to the larger geopolitical landscape? There we go. I can still,
you know, I mean, and that's the what you've got young kid doing splendidly. It's better than I had a weekend with my niece last weekend, and I was just done. Just done for the next week. In terms of numbers, I mean, all you tend to get, as you'll know, is there'll be 200 ships appear off your coast, and we have to sort of do the math, as you would say. There are 40, 60 people in each of those ships, and these are round numbers and exaggerating for effect. I mean, I just tend to think that it's so expensive to maintain arms. It's so expensive to maintain the horses. The horses are really important in the Viking world. I think that's the first thing that the Great Army do. For example, when they get to East Anglia, they persuade these Anglians to give them horses, because horses are expensive. The fodder we're talking about, Terry's talking about logistics as well, things like that. So I don't get the impression that you need vast numbers. It's kind of like if you've got controls of logistics, and I think probably if you've got a few hundred people in an army, and they're all very well armed, and they've got horses and they've got ships as well, so they can get to places quickly, and they're kind of well fed and they're motivated. I think you don't need huge amounts of people in an army. We never find early medieval battlefields, so it's kind of difficult to really say this was a big battle, and we can extrapolate. Oh, actually, there are 200 people on each side, or there are 2,000 people on each side. I think the Great Army extent is going to be in the low thousands, but I think its probable strength is that it can grow. And I think the fact is a bit like the Roman Empire. They're quite small C Catholic. They will take in whatever people, and I think their strength is the fact they're a very attractive group of people. If you start off with, say, 300 or 400 warriors, I think you could attract probably that again just through your success. So, and I think what you're getting with something like the Galloway Horde, when you've got these silver, I mean, you can maybe explain to your listeners that if we need more background, but an amazing horde from about 900 that was discovered a few years ago in southwestern Scotland. But it's noted for looking very much like it's from all over. There's a lot of stuff from the Irish Sea region. There are these broadband silver armorings, which are, but they're originally actually developed in southern Scandinavia, and then suddenly from about the 860s, they're developed in sort of Ireland. So again, one of these links between southern Scandinavia and Ireland. But the thing about some of these broadband armorings in this Galloway Horde in southwest Scotland is that they've got runic inscriptions on them. Interesting. You think, okay, they're going to have runic inscriptions on them, but they're actually in Anglian runes. So they're Anglo-Saxons, they're Northumbrians that have written their names on this. They're maybe acting like Vikings, whatever, at that time. So I think that was a bit of a game changer when we suddenly thought, because they're all think, people would have joined in and they would have collected waifs and strays and their armies would have got bigger. So if they started small, they could have maximized that force relatively quickly. I think things like the Galloway Horde are possibly showing that that's actually how that's happening. Your Northumbrians because there's Northumbria extends into what is now southern Scotland. So you get an Anglo-Saxon kingdoms operating in Lothian and Galloway. And I think if you can get these guys interested in joining you and acting like Vikings and perhaps depositing hordes that everyone would have thought absolutely completely Viking, and then you get this, they're they're possibly Northumbrian, that I think that's maybe seeing how you can get the impact, because it's not just the numbers that you're getting off the ships with, it's the fact that you're probably being able to persuade people quite quickly to join you. So I think, you know, over the course of that summer season, you're raiding, your numbers will swell with local warriors. And again, you get that local knowledge in, you get, actually, this is a place you want to raid, you want to go to this place, Repton, it's really good, it's got lots of fodder in for the winter. And I think that's maybe how that explains how you don't need to have huge numbers. You want to, they would have known the certain amount it would have taken to win a battle. But I think, you know, once you've won that first battle, then you're going to have people that are going to be joining your side.
Well, that brings up a great point. A lot of times when I explore this topic and I have discussions with people, there's this sense that anybody who's within Christendom is operating differently than the Vikings. Now, the Viking Age Scandinavians at the beginning of the Viking Age had a very distinct culture, language, etc. But in terms of the warrior culture of this idea of I'm going to go out and I'm going to gain wealth, I mean, that was still common, even though they'd Christianized, say, like in France, the Carolingians, right? Like the whole reason Charlemagne was so expansionist wasn't because he was inherently interested in spreading Christendom. It's because he had a retinue of warriors who needed to be paid. And to pay them, they had to raid and conquer, etc. And so if Vikings show up off the coast of France, and there's a local lord who's got a bunch of knights that he's not paying properly, and then the Vikings say, well, hey, we have all this silver. Next thing you know, these guys are all going Viking, right? Just for a short amount of time. So this idea that they would be able to hire mercenaries essentially within the areas that they're going. So then I can show up. So then I don't need 1,000 men to take Paris. I need 250 convincing, lethal-looking guys, and then I can hire Frisians and Normans and everybody, and then coalesce. So essentially, these fleets were probably, and I think there's a study that just came out that's showing this. I didn't read it yet, but it was making the news or the rounds on social media about how diverse of a group we're talking about too, because there's a lot of intermixing. There's that DNA study that was done a couple of years ago where they showed, it was a National Geographic that said, oh, we actually found out that these people were from all over and they were intermixing and everything. Okay, that makes sense. There's a new study that came out that actually showed that the composition of these groups wasn't the same. Like they were like you said, like these small pockets, but it's not just small pockets of Scandinavians. It's small pockets of Scandinavians mixed in with small pockets of essentially raiders from all these other areas, right? And they're all coalescing together for a common goal briefly, and then breaking apart and going off and doing their own thing, which is fascinating, right? Because now we're not talking about a Viking Age where it's just Scandinavians doing all the work. It's Scandinavians leading the charge, but then also rallying together people from the lands that they're roving in order to help them achieve their aims, right? I mean, these were true capitalists, right?
Well,
yeah,
that's a question, right? And actually, I've heard that put to you in other podcasts. I think maybe even in the Shindig one. It's like is what they're doing like an early form of capitalism, right? I mean, it's hard to not like think of that. I mean, obviously because it's what we know, so we sort of make it relative to what we know, but. I mean, I even said that in the piece that I wrote. It's like, by our modern standards of how corporations work, and the Vikings are management, and the rest of the people are like the workers or something, these people that are coming and going that CJ's talking about. And the way they sort of seem to have structured it for their success seems kind of similar to what we got going on here in some ways.
Yeah, you're also going to get pushback when you transpose, modern economic terms.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you can't have the idea within the word capitalism and say that there's, I mean, again, inherent is probably the wrong word, but I think, people, again, anthropological studies seem to show that, where there is a way to develop a means of exchange, regardless of what that, if it's precious metal or whatever it is, cloth, people will realize that that's kind of the only way you can begin to expand and do things beyond your village. And that's what people end up doing, because people naturally kind of get bored with what they've got. They want to look over the horizon. And to do that with the neighboring valley, the neighboring village, you've got to develop a means of exchange. If you develop a means of exchange, which most societies seem to do all over the world and at all times, is capitalism, whatever you want to call it, but it's it's a way to facilitate you to get things that you want. And of course, people then will take that to success. People will be better at it than others, and winners and users. And this is no judgment call. I'm, very sort of centrist dad, as they say in these things. I'm like, people, do whatever makes them happy, and we should all, try and share the wealth where we can, but realizing that capitalism is just always a way that people are going to operate, because like democracy, it works, and a lot of people aren't happy with it all the time. But if you can present to the world an alternative that kind of works, that people will naturally gravitate towards, then sure. But I don't think there doesn't seem to be one at the moment.
I think that, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing when you talk, well, even in the title of your book, plug number 3, a Viking market kingdom. I mean, you're talking about markets, we still talk about markets, and you can use, language like supply and demand, of all kinds of commodities, whether it's, silver or human beings or cloth or maybe even salt, right, CJ?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, these things are things that we can relate to. And I think in some ways you can think, okay, some of the behaviors are already there. And like you say, like cross-culturally throughout human history, it's just a way people survive and get what they need or get what they want. And then, in the 18th century, Adam Smith just sort of codifies it in a certain way, and gives it to the world. But yeah, I think you can't escape the fact that it feels similar.
Yeah, I just was great. We went to the same schools as me, so I was like,
plugging for the Scottish.
My French grandfather wrote a book called "The Climate Victory," La Victoire Climatique. So he's retired now. He was an entrepreneur his whole life. It's an interesting story what he was able to do. He took a loan from the French government back in the early 1950s, I believe, to revitalize the fisheries in Western France. And then he used this collateral to build an even bigger boat. And then he sailed to Africa, to Senegal, and then started in the tuna fishing derbies. And then he used the live bait technique that he learned from the Basque that nobody else had. And so he won the derbies year after year. He was also known for being the first mixed cruise. He hired Africans. So, yeah, I mean, this guy was a true Viking, right? Like he went out there and entrepreneur. But in his book, the Victoire Climatique, he talks about capitalism as being this driving force that's helped the economy, but it's also like wrecking the planet because we're just consuming all the resources, etc. But I don't know if this is true. I haven't actually looked it up, but I trust him because he's a very intelligent man, very learned, self-taught, and then he does his research. And he mentions that the genesis of capitalism as we understand it today started in Portugal with a single ship. And the idea was these merchants came together and pooled their resources to fund an enterprise, is what they called it. The first enterprise. They pooled their resources to build the ship to then go to the new world and explore and get new wealth. And that was kind of the beginning of what we call an enterprise and modern capitalism. But if you take that and you transpose it onto the Viking Age, and maybe this is appropriate, or maybe it's not, but I'm going to go with it. The Vikings, if you think about how they rearranged their entire home economy to build these ships to go abroad, right? We've talked to Terry and I before about the resources, the vast resources needed just to build one ship. And now they're building 100, 200. So the entire local economy in Scandinavia had to change to accommodate this outward expansion. And so now we have a scenario where I imagine there are a lot of chieftains and leaders of local communities pooling tremendous resources to the point where they have to completely redo how society works, right? Which I think gave an end to Christianity, because then they realized that, hey, this hierarchical system of organizing society really works well for this. And then so they have to redo it. But it's almost like, that's kind of this is almost the beta version of what happened in Portugal then 500 years later, right? 600 years later.
No, that's about what your grandfather's point is. I mean, yeah, because I use Brodel through my friends. It was University of Glasgow for my PhD and masters, and you because you were in a mixed department, so you were getting people that were looking at things from the Bronze Age and looking at things through into the early modern period. And one of my friends put me on to Fernand Brodel, and this idea of pre-industrial but different forms of capitalism, and especially in a maritime trade sort of world that can develop. And again, it just makes you think that humans will find a way, like the Vikings will find a way. They'll if you're successful. I think it's Soren Sinbeck also says, a documentary I was watching saying this becomes the only game in town. If you're not doing what the next valley are doing, they're going to take over your valley. So it's going to be like once that ball starts rolling, it snowballs essentially. And there's great work done on tar pits that they find in Scandinavia now as well, because you've got to develop all that tar, you've got to waterproof everything, you've got to there's so many elements that have, and you have to have regularity. Going back to again what we're talking about, everything's got to be replicable after a while, or otherwise it just, you get that one ship, that's all well and good, but again the next valley's got 4 ships and then they're getting all the wealth and everyone in your valley is going to that valley and so you've got to say, oh, what are they doing? Right, we'll replicate that as well. And then you can see how it spreads up into Arctic Norway as well. There's some great recent research, and I mean, I'll forget everyone's references at the moment, but if anyone listening to this podcast just wants to ever message me and get references, they don't have to buy the book, but they can ask me, because there's loads of great work. People, it might just be someone's master's or whatever, and they have this great thought, and they find this site, and then it's just getting that knowledge and incorporating it into the rest. But essentially what we're finding again is wherever you go in Scandinavia, you're tending to find these same patterns, whether it's trading sites or how that they're creating these resource controls that they can create these ships, that they get enough of the ships, and it's not just that one ship. That's I think the interesting way that we can look at how the Viking world develops, and then you're going to get these modern parallels with the early modern Mediterranean, and you can look at Brodel and sort of see the ways that they're looking at tramping traders that are going up and down the coast, and then you get the traders, the Soren Sinbeck school, that are going sort of direct from these nodal points to nodal points. Anyway that works, you've got to produce these ships, and you've got to produce the goods that go in them, and you've got to have enough, and they've got to be regular. So there are just all these mini industries, these cottage industries that are all strung together, so it creates something bigger in the landscape that really is an industrial landscape, but it's in this pre-industrial sort of world to create these trade networks that we see the evidence of everywhere.
Yeah, I remember when we were talking with Ben about this and what it took to just get, these ships together and everything. And he said he never thought he'd get so excited about woodland management.
I know Ben well, and I can see excited about management, to be fair. Yeah.
Well, the economic theory, though, I mean, we kind of keep beating that horse just a little bit. I mean, so what you're talking about, it sounds to me like, if we're going to talk about sort of pre-capitalism versus capitalism, the mercantilism, right? So the Vikings are kind of operating on this idea when you're talking about, we have 1 ship, they have 4. Okay, we got to hurry up and catch up, or we've got to get it before they do, kind of thing. Sort of this idea of, the resources in the world being this finite pie, and by definition, if I have it, it means you don't get it, right?
The zero-sum game. Yeah.
So
I think you'd enjoy my books. I got a negative review recently, and I love getting negative reviews because they make me laugh most of the time, because it's just fascinating me to see how different people will view my work. And actually, when I first started writing, I'd get really upset because I'd be like, oh, why? And then now I actually see it as like a mark of like, well, first of all, if I'm getting bad reviews, it means people are reading it. So it's not successful. And second of all, some of these reviews are they're just gold, because they do point out some of the things in the book that then I think, yeah, it is interesting that they would see it that way. And I had one gentleman, I think he was in England actually. And I think it was a 2 or 3 star review, which is generally considered to not be great. And he said, it's about the second book in the series. So the first book in the series is a real coming of age kind of adventure, The second one's when he's like, the character is just a little bit more evolved, and he's really trying to make a name for himself. But how he does it is he's trying to make money, basically. And his first thought isn't raiding. It's let's control this salt trade in Western France. And so the reviewer basically said, well, the author spent most of the book, with the character being an incompetent salt farmer. It's just boring. And I was like, and I thought about it and I was like, yeah, I guess that wouldn't be very exciting, would it? but it's the reality of what was happening at the time, right? Or how I imagined it, right? Taking all these economic ideas on, what did spur people to go? It wasn't just they didn't go explicitly to kill, as Hollywood would have you believe, right? They're not just showing up and being like, we're just here to kill you because we don't like you. No, they had an economic aim. They were there to make money. And if they didn't have to kill, I love the example of the Rus who would go east and they would set up little markets and all they would do is they take their ships and flip them upside down. I've seen this I saw it referenced when I was in college. We did an early Russia class and he talked about this, flipping the ships upside down, using them as the roof of their little market. So it's like they're showing up and they're not as violent as we, I mean, there's a lot of violence, but what I mean to say is the main goal was economic at its base, and sometimes that doesn't make for great fiction, right?
No, I mean, this is the site. I was digging a site in 2019, Happier Times in Ukraine, and you got dirhams there as well. So again, the trade, but the most amazing thing you would see was where you could see in the stratigraphy down. So there was this kind of like headland, and then there's the river kind of went around it, and on one side you could see where the ships had been dragged in. So you saw where the keel had been dragged through the sand, and again that was it. It was kind of like where they were was based on trade, and what they were doing was based on money that was coming from thousands of miles away, and they were controlling this loop in the river, and you're controlling that loop in the river because ships and trade are going past it, and there's a sort of citadel on the top, and most of the sort of more sort of Scandinavian Rus sort of artifacts are in this little sort of citadel that they discovered. So yeah, that's it. And I think you talk about your writings as well, this sort of mafia idea, but yeah, if they can sit there and take a cut and can control things, and they're not having to go out and risk getting killed, as happens, you see it at Repton. You see what happens when it goes wrong. You see the famous burials, the chap that had he got a spear that seems to have gone into his eye socket in his helmet and then risen up, and then somebody chopped off his private parts, for want of a better word. He's the guy with the boar's tusk that was replacing it as well. You see what happens when it goes wrong. And if you go to Repton, it's on this bluff overlooking the Trent, the old Trent water as it is now, but the Trent. And again, they're going to the same places, but you see very much at Repton what happens when it goes wrong. And you've got the charnel house there with hundreds of bodies in it. So they knew that it was this very sort of fine line between ending up in a grave with a boar's tusk or being the king of Jorvik in Dublin. And you'd much rather be sitting there just taking your 5% off everybody that comes in. And they'll have seen the Anglo-Saxon kings, they'll have seen the Frankish kings. That's what they're doing. They're essentially changing the money every so often and getting a cut off that. That's what you want to do. You just want to get just money. If it's lower rates, it's not as shiny. But if you can guarantee bringing that money in, then you can make sure that your supporters and your princelings, whatever, aren't going to revolt because you can pay them off constantly. So I think that's the safest way, because otherwise it's highly contingent that, you go raiding, you either get killed or you don't get enough stuff there, and then you have to go back at the end of that raiding season, and then you can't pay all your retainers, and then they go off to the next valley. It must have been stressful, but I think they would have known ways that would have potentially made it less stressful. And I think less stressful is the trade end of the spectrum, that raiding is on the other end of that spectrum.
Are we going to have like the takeaway from this podcast? This is going to be the title: The Vikings Were Lazy.
But don't use the word lazy. Don't use the word lazy.
So that'll be in parentheses, but don't use the word lazy.
Yeah, right.
Laissez-faire. The Vikings were laissez-faire.
Yeah, there you go. No, yeah. Well, there you go. I guess we could do that in a nod to Steve there, because he's Breton. We'll use a French phrase for our Vikings.
Yeah, I like it.
Laissez-faire. Okay.
Well, so I want to ask you, like, just I guess quickly here. I mean, we're kind of hopefully we're not going too long for you, because we could go on forever. But like, all right, the Viking world, like them, east, west, north to south. I mean, this is a large area, and it's you know, just like today, all kinds of goods and products and services that are traded all the time. And so, you know, like you mentioned, so there's the silver that's important, you know, the salt, the homespun, the walrus ivory, the furs, whatever, like all of this stuff, right? But I mean, if you kind of had to, which is kind of a stupid question, I suppose, but I mean, if you had to say like, all right, if they were going to be like, all chips are in and we could only trade this one thing because it's the most lucrative thing, what do you think that would be for them?
Slaves.
Yeah, I agree.
It's nothing.
Right.
I think I called it. Yeah, that's it. Done. We're finished. No, I mean, I think I called it without too much of a pun, the sort of dark, the sort of the dark matter. It's that thing that we don't see, but connects everything together, and it kind of makes sense of everything. So I think the physics equivalent of the dark matter is the trade in slaves, and I think that's the sine qua non. I think if you don't have that, you kind of don't have a kingdom, you don't have a trading empire, you don't have a trading city if you don't have the slaves, really. You can look beyond that, you know, and say all these, you know, silks, or as you say, you know, various forms of cloth, whatever, and there's going to be pelts. There's going to be lots of things that are there in bulk. Again, Søren Sindbæk, you're talking about the importance of things that you're trading in bulk, but I just can't see the logic behind that world and the success of it unless it is not based on slavery. And of course, the big issue with that is talking about being dark matter. We can't really see it really most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, and talking about the inputs and outputs, right? I mean, it's like you have to have, you know, the community that supports this kind of activity. And the way you have that is you've got the, you know, I mean, who's building the boats? Who's weaving the sails? You know, we can say it's women weaving the sails. How many of those women are free versus how many of them are unfree? You know, and that, I mean, you need those bodies as the human resource input to even make this enterprise not only happen, but grow, if that's your intention, right? So they're part of, they're the currency, and they're the mechanism by which it happens. I mean, just like slavery in all times, right? At that level.
Yeah, and I you know, it's frustrating that it's not something that you can archaeologically find very, very easily. Of course, with the developments, with the factors, you know, with isotopic analysis of tooth enamel, and as well as aDNA or ancient DNA, in future with bigger data sets, we're talking about 100, 200 years from now, when they've got the sort of vast data sets that we can only dream of now, they might be able to have a better idea. This person grew up in Ireland, and oh, they've ended up in Sweden, and and then we're getting lots of that happening. You're going, oh, okay, then we can say that is very much, you know, internecine sort of Irish warfare leading to somebody spending the rest of their life in a farm outside of near Birka, and you know, maybe that'll happen, maybe it won't happen, but I just think, yeah, you know, the historical evidence is that when they go somewhere like you talked earlier about me, my volunteering at the Govan Stones, which is a kingdom Strathclyde, so a northern Brittonic old Welsh speaking kingdom based around the Clyde Valley, and they have this citadel that's basically a sort of an extinct volcano. So two of these massive plugs, it looks like something of Lord of the Rings. You can imagine two sort of citadels on the top of this, and it sits over the mighty sort of Clyde River and the River Leven that leads up to the famous Loch Lomond. So it controls this sort of confluence of rivers. And what we know from the history is that the Vikings in 870 come up from Dublin. I think there seem to be coming, Tim Clarkson would suggest that they're also coming up from the Great Army in England as well at that time. And they besieged Dumbarton Rock, which means Rock of Fortress of the Britons. They would have called it Alt Clut, which means Rock of the Clyde or whatever in the local Welsh Brittonic language. But they besieged that for 4 months. Now, that's a huge investment. People just don't besiege things in the early medieval period. It's really, really difficult. But they put a lot of resource into this. It's obviously very important. And as it turns out, for the next decade, they spend a lot of their summers raiding against the Picts in central Scotland. And they're in some sort of alliance, or at least take over, at least for a time, this kingdom of Strathclyde that then moves to sort of govern and partake in what is now Glasgow. But what we get from the Annals of Ulster is, after they take this Dumbarton Rock, Alt Clut, and they spend that summer raiding, then they go back to Ireland with 200 ships full of slaves, and you know the slaves are from all over. They're Anglo-Saxons, they're Britons, wherever, they're Picts, And I think that's key. They're putting this massive, I mean, if we take it at face value, they're putting this massive resource into taking this site that then allows them to secure their rear and then slave raid essentially for an entire summer. And then these 200 ships are going back to Dublin. Why do you have Dublin? Because it's a really good place to trade with Western England. It's a really good place to trade up to Iceland. It's a really good place to trade up to, down into the Mediterranean as well. So the historical evidence all seems to point towards it. The archaeological evidence, obviously, just by its very nature, is very difficult. But I think when you do see it, they're fighting, they're taking slaves. When you've got that treaty between Alfred and Guthrum, they're talking about slaves as well. It just seems to be unlikely that this is not happening without it being a huge part of the world that they live in.
I think so. The second edition of your book, A Viking Market Kingdom in Ireland and Britain, trade networks and the importation of a Southern slave economy.
That's yeah. I think that's it. I think I possibly would have if the evidence had been there, but then if you start doing that, then you're just the hostage to the fortune of the no evidence. But why is the silver? The silver's moving about again, but probably because of the slavery. But what we find is the silver, and it's there, and I can study it and look at it, and
it's in your hand. Yeah.
Well, we had a conversation with Dr. Matthew Panesi about monastic loot, and I don't think we naturally gravitated towards slaves as one of the. I mean, I think we talked about it, but it wasn't like our top thing. But if you just looking into it, at a cursory glance, it does make a lot of sense. I mean, you mentioned you lean into Soren Sindebeck's research a lot, and he talks about the kind of the offsetting of the silver standard because of the influx of Islamic silver from the east. So now you've got your kingdoms or chiefdoms in Norway and Denmark who are trying to compete with this inflated silver price. So then they start expanding, and if you think of like what would the Swedes have been interested in trading, all that silver for? And slaves is the number one thing probably. And if you think about hitting monasteries first, and what do you have in a monastery? You have a bunch of men who are physically capable of doing manual labor and who are not armed. And so you can just kind of waltz in there and pick up a lot of slaves really quickly, really easily. And it doesn't matter what else is there, right? I mean, whatever else is there that they can take, portable wealth, sure. But the main aim could very, very likely, and I have not read your book. I'm sorry, it was a little too expensive on Amazon over here in the US. But
it's now in paperback. It's now in paperback. It's
okay. I'll check it out then. Yeah. But given the title that Terry has referenced multiple times, I presume that would be your go-to. Is yes, they were there for the slaves. And to expand on that, when they went to Lindisfarne, makes sense. And then they go over to Iona a couple of years later. That also makes sense. And then, like, real quick, they go to Noirmoutier off the coast of France, which is Saint-Philbert. And these are all remote monasteries that have these young, work-capable, good slave material, right?
Well fed.
Yeah, well fed, exactly. Yeah.
Again, you can trade on the literate. You can sell this slave can read and write. That's a premium as well. So yeah.
And then in France, they went back pretty much every year, starting kind of in the 810s, right? Like we have we have the chronicles from Saint-Philbert. Hermonter is the guy, Hermontarius. It talks about these frequent and persistent raids that keep coming back. And then if you think about it, it took a long time for anybody to go back to Lindisfarne after that raid, right? So they didn't hit it again. Makes sense. And then same thing in Iona. They hit it again later, but it took a long time for them to repopulate that monastery. Saint-Philbert, they repopulated the next year. And so, of course, so it could just be that these frequent, persistent raids were precisely because the monks couldn't figure out. They're like, why do they keep coming back here? Well, it's because you keep sending young, able men into the monastery to be right for the taking.
And replenishing the precious metal stuff, right? That is
right, everything, right? They're just like, oh, let's come back and put everybody back in here. And so the Vikings are like, they're just making this really easy for us. Like they just don't get it.
Well, in my super sophisticated academic way, I just called the monastic sites, the ATM machines of the Viking world. Yeah. It's like, you want a quick infusion, that's where you go. Get your cash, whether it's in, portable wealth that's precious metal or portable wealth that's a human being. It's kind of a no-brainer, not to sound sort of callous and flippant about it, but from their standpoint, I can imagine. If we're going to be talking about Vikings in terms of path of least resistance all the time, which is smart, that kind of sounds like it to me.
Yeah, I mean, and again, we've all done the same thing. We all, if something works, we tend to do it again until, you know, we get a bloody nose, and then we'll do something slightly different, you know. And the Vikings would have just done it slightly further down the coast or in another jurisdiction, essentially, where they think they could get away with it. But, you know, fundamentally, we know the Viking ages that, you know, they kind of didn't change. Second Viking age, you're getting more kingdoms that are kind of doing it now. You get the sort of Forkbeard and Knut sort of era of things, when they're essentially kind of, they've got a kingdom or several, an empire behind them. And even then, it's like, if they can get off their boats and get the Danegeld or whatever becomes known as the Danegeld, they'll happily leave you alone after that. They've got what they wanted, essentially. So it does change. But even then, I was reading a bit more about the Second Viking Age as well, and they're still going in and raiding and fighting if they want. But in the main, it's essentially they're wanting to get all this amazing English silver coin, and there's lots of it, and people will happily give it to them. It's become a strategy. And so, yeah, I think, this path of least resistance, that, yeah, if you know, but eventually it becomes so easy, and they realize how weak the sort of late Anglo-Saxon kingdom is in terms of its political control is the wrong word, but in terms of, you know, it's beautifully structured. Again, it's why the Normans want it afterwards as well. But the fact is that it's a bit like, you know, going back to Al-Andalus with the invasions from North Africa. You kill one Visigothic king, and then suddenly, hey presto, you've got this kingdom. So again, the path of least resistance is, you get rid of a king, you get a kingdom. So the Vikings, the Scandinavians at that time, are just going to do that. They're not going to fritter around the edges. They're going to say, oh, we can take the kingdom now in one go. Yeah, why not?
It's science. It's like, you know, it took until the late 17th century for Newton to outline it for us, but the Vikings are basically operating under physics, the laws of physics. You keep doing what you're doing until you meet resistance, right? And then it governs.
And I think, yeah, you know, I think that's it. I mean, and of course, it's, you know, as you were saying earlier, you don't want to be sort of superficial about these things, but I think sometimes it does really help, just because we're meant to be science communicators here, and this is what we're doing, is like saying to people, this is the easiest way to understand it, and it's helping us as well. Talking through podcasts like this help you kind of streamline your thinking, and you can think of it in these more sort of superficial terms, but superficial doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's an easier way of of saying the kind of the key point to make is that, yeah, they go where they think they're going to get the most return with the least risk. So yeah.
Well, I think so. I mean, kind of to wrap it up, then maybe what are we on here, about a little hour and 20 or so. To do, like, just maybe finish with a little bit of a statement about what you just kind of started or alluded to there, which is what we're all doing here. You know, me through, you know, teaching at college, university, CJ through writing his historical fiction set in the Viking Age, you doing, you know, archaeology and your museum work and everything. I mean, it's always like knowledge creation, but what do we have if we don't like get it out there? You know, can you speak to like your thoughts on, you know, and because you're involved in media outreach and everything as well. So, I mean, I imagine that this is important to you.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to probably the easiest way of saying it is, you know, if you think about archaeology, which is, you know, I still dig on Viking Age sites, also do Second World War sites, I'll do whatever. I mean, the fundamental thing is archaeology is destructive. So if we go to a site and we dig a trench, we're destroying that for anyone else to see. And if we don't report it properly, and if we don't subsequently get it out to the public, we are no better than anyone else that just deliberately goes and destroys some archaeology. We're on a podcast the other week with my company, and they're talking about, you know, Irish prehistoric North Atlantic rock art. And in the past, if people saw some and they thought this is going to be a problem for my development, they might just dynamite an entire panel of sort of late Neolithic rock art, the cup and ring marks that we all know so well. So we're no better than that if we don't record it. And I think that's just not enough nowadays as well, because you know, it's in an ivory tower. A lot of this stuff, the access, you know, is within a library or within a sort of online library system. So I think even if we've got report, we're kind of duty bound morally, at the very least, to get that information out there. Otherwise, we've kind of just destroyed the site and know that it's just a few of us and our peers that will ever get to see it, and then we just kind of keep all this lovely information to ourselves. And then, you know, something goes horribly wrong at a Viking Congress, and we're all dead, and then suddenly you're lost all this knowledge. But if you can get it out in a podcast, you can get it out in a popular article in newspaper, then suddenly millions of people can see it. And I think that's fun to do. It's fun to try and think of it, and it helps us think about things on every possible level as well, in terms of, you know, because it's that classic thing, if you can explain something, you understand it. And I think if you can't explain it and to the general public, to your friends, then you don't really actually understand what you're talking about. So I think it's important for us as academics and writers and authors, as much as it is just for anybody. We've got to share the knowledge and help us understand it, and help the world understand all the stuff that we know is so fascinating. And yeah, it would be a shame for us just to keep it to ourselves.
Yeah, amen to that. That's awesome. 100% agree, right, CJ?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, with that, thank you so much again for sharing your thoughts and your time with us. Really, really interesting. We could go on forever, but alas, we should probably stop so you can get on with your evening and we can get on with our day.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and as I say, it's not just lip service. I do really appreciate the chance, because I've had a lot of time research that lots of other people have paid for, including very much my parents. So the fact is, I can sort of give it back a bit as well, and my mum will certainly be listening to this. So hi, Mum.
You've made them proud.
Hi, Tom's mom.
Hi, Tom's mom.
Hi, Marjorie. How you doing?
Yeah.
Well, it's very nice to meet you. Really appreciate the conversation. Really appreciate you coming on the show. This was a great one. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And and the baby's still asleep. Yay! We made it. We made it.